In digital culture studies, one of the basic tenets is that technology affects culture and culture affects technology. This article by Langdon is one of the foundational articles in discussing this point and how that relationship between technology and society works. You can find the article through the university library website. Just search for the author and the title. That will show you the article right at the top. It says it's available online. Click through and you'll see it's in JSTOR. Click through and you'll get access to the article and you can download the PDF. If you're not on campus, you will need to use a VPN connection to the library to get access to this article. So let's take a look at what Langdon actually writes. What my goal for this short presentation is to give you a bit of an overview of the article so that you can read it yourself more easily. Langdon discusses the point of view that society is behind all technology, so that any technology is determined by what the social and the economic system is. What matters is not technology itself, but the social or economic system in which it is embedded. This is an argument that social constructivists tend to make, and it's an argument that you'll see many times. People will say, well, it's not Facebook's fault you're in an echo chamber, or that you're only seeing news that agrees with what you already think. It's the fault of your society, your culture, your cultural choices. If you chose to follow other friends, then you'd see news from other places. Winner says this argument isn't good enough. It's sort of an obvious argument, but there's more to it than that. Technology also controls things. And this general argument that, well, it's the society around us that determines our technology is known as the social construction of technology. So the next argument is a naive technological determinism, and this is kind of the opposite argument. The idea, Winner writes, the idea that technology develops as the sole result of an internal dynamic, and then unmediated by any other influence, molds society to fit its patterns. So this is the idea that technology just is, and we can't do anything about it, and we just have to follow whatever technology wants. And there are certainly people who make these arguments, like Willem Flusser. His arguments about how technology works certainly follow this pattern. This point of view is called technological determinism, and it's very often criticized as being too simple. But Winner tries to complicate things a bit more by saying it's not just the one or the other. And in fact, very often, technology does determine the way we're able to act. And his first example is the bridges. These are called parkways, these bridges, these low bridges that lead from New York City to Long Island. Now, you may not know, but Long Island is this beautiful island outside New York. It's part of New York City, strictly speaking. It has beaches, beautiful parks, and usually quite rich people live there. And the person who designed the parks on Long Island, but also the roads that lead there, his name was Moses. He designed these low bridges that are only 3 meters high. And that means you can drive a car through, but you can't drive a bus through them. That means you need to be rich enough to have a car of your own to get to Long Island. So if you were a poor person, an African-American person perhaps, who did not own a car and needed to rely on public transport, you couldn't get to Long Island. So this is a technology that very, very deliberately limits what people are able to do and affects the possible culture of Long Island. Another example he mentions quickly is the Boulevards of Paris. So after rioting in Paris in the 19th century, during those riots, the protesters put up barricades in the streets. This is a map that shows the old map of Paris with lots and lots of narrow streets. And then Haussmann, the architect who Napoleon asked to reinvent Paris. And the main strategy for that was just demolishing the old narrow streets and making these really wide boulevards. And this is what the boulevards looked like. They're so wide that there's no way you can barricade them. And so you can't, the people can't fight against the military. There's plenty of room for tanks in those streets. So this is another very deliberate example of a way that technology is designed to have specific cultural and societal effects. But of course, very often technology does affect our culture, but it's not an intentional. People didn't intend the technology to have those effects. So, for instance, one of Winner's examples is accessibility for people who use wheelchairs, for instance. It wasn't until the 1970s that people started thinking that, oh, we actually could build ramps instead of stairs everywhere and make the city more accessible for people in wheelchairs. But people didn't probably design cities on purpose so that people with wheelchairs couldn't get in there. Another example, which Winner doesn't mention because it's it's an example that people have become aware of more recently, is the way that photography is calibrated for white skin. The first analog cameras, they had to calibrate the way that the negative photographs were printed so that the skin tones and contrast would come out right. And the way that photographers did this was they had a Shirley card, and this is one example of them. The Shirley cards, they're called that because the woman on the first one was called Shirley, apparently. But Shirley cards always had a woman with light skin, dark hair, and skin showing. And it was the standard way that the film was supposed to be developed. So the photographers would try then developing their negatives and try to get them to match this appearance. And this meant that all photographs were being calibrated for light skin, for white people, right? So if you tried to take a photograph of a person with dark skin next to a person with white skin, the person with white skin would come out, you'd be able to see their facial features, but the dark-skinned person's skin or their face would hardly be visible. The film itself was actually designed to make these photographs look beautiful. So the film itself was designed for white-skinned people. It wasn't until the 1970s that this changed, with Kodak Gold, actually, which was the first kind of film that was really designed to show graduations of dark things. And it wasn't because people wanted to be able to take good pictures of dark-skinned people. No, it was chocolate manufacturers and people who were trying to sell chocolate and trying to sell dark wood furniture. They started complaining that when they tried to make advertisements with photographs of dark wood furniture or chocolate, they weren't getting enough contrast, they weren't getting enough detail in their photographs. And so Kodak and other photography companies started making film to show the details in darker objects. And that, happily enough, also meant that it became much more easy to make good photographs of people with dark skin. And yet, it's still not great. Now, of course, we have digital images and there's a lot of automatic image recognition and so forth, but all the algorithms have been mostly tuned to people with light skin, Californians. And one of the results in that is, for instance, this fairly recent example. I think this was Google Photos, and Google Photos sorts your photos automatically for you. But as you can see, it sorted human faces and marked them as gorillas, which is pretty shocking, really. The problem here is that this, of course, was not intentional, one assumes. The problem here is that the algorithm for sorting different images into different categories was trained to recognize white human faces and not diverse human faces. Now, one really interesting point that Winner makes that I think is really important to remember is that given that technology actually works like this, where technology actually does affect the things we're able to do, whether we're able to enter buildings, whether we're able to have a school photograph that shows black and white children equally well, we should actually consider that technology is like a legislative act or a political founding. it establishes a framework for public order that will endure over many generations. So the algorithms that we design or the machines we build are actually as important as the laws that our governments make, because they affect the way we're able to act in the world. Another example that Winner gives is solar power versus nuclear power. So many people have argued that if you have a society that bases itself on using nuclear power, you actually have to have a very authoritarian government. Nuclear power has to be very well controlled. You need a big power station. There has to be extreme safety. You can't just let anyone set up their own nuclear power station, obviously. Whereas solar power is perfect for decentralization, because anybody can safely set up put solar panels on their roof and run their own power system and maybe go off the grid. So in this case, you've got two technologies, nuclear power versus solar power, which actually allow very different kinds of organizations of your society. And some people argue that in every time period, there's always going to be some technologies that support an authoritarian society and some that support a decentralized, more bottom-up society. Winner doesn't really take a stand on that, but he says that this is possible. Now, one interesting point is that we need to think about whether, well, is this intentional or not? So solar power, nuclear power, is it like, did somebody design nuclear power with the intention of having an authoritarian society? Or what, and more importantly perhaps, who does this serve? Is this good for somebody? Is it good for somebody with power, and why? One example is railways. Arguably, when you had horses and buggies, people could build their own roads pretty easily. But if you've got a railway system, you have to have centralized organization. You have to have a system where people are keeping time, where you're making sure that there's no crashing, that the railways are arriving. You have to have people coordinating the railway stations, etc. But technologies don't necessarily always require a particular kind of organization. Maybe you can think of a way railways could run without centralization. Radio became a one-way technology in the 20th century. But the first radios were two ways, right? And ham radio does still exist. There are still people who have radios that can both send and receive. Bertolt Brecht, the playwright, wrote an interesting article in the 30s about the radio as an apparatus of communication, where he says, why is this not a two-way medium? And it totally could have been. Radios sold today and in the 20th century can only receive, they can't send. But you could absolutely imagine a society where everybody had a radio that could send as well as receive. What would that society have looked like? And who decided to take the sender out of radios that were sold to the public? Was it in the interest of broadcasting companies that were founded because on this model of one-to-many mass communication? Or perhaps the ruling class didn't actually want ordinary people being able to express themselves and share their opinions with their peers? Now, Langdon Winner says there's two basic ways in which technology affects us. One is that the technology is deliberately built in order to control us in some particular way, like the bridges in New York. The second is that the technology just the technology carries with it certain effects, like railways cause centralization, but it may not have been intended, and perhaps it could have been otherwise. And in those cases, the choice about whether or not to adopt a new technology is incredibly important as writing laws or making political decisions. And that's what we should think about today when we consider new forms of social media, new forms of information technology and other technologies. We need to be thinking about what are the societal consequences, the cultural consequences of introducing this form of technology. Now, it's a while since Langdon Winner wrote this article, but I was quite pleased upon Googling him to find that he's still very active online. He has a blog, he has a Twitter, so it's pretty easy to see what Langdon Winner's current opinions are on the world. Thank you.